Silas Crow didn't knock. He never knocked. A man with 3 lawyers, a forged deed, and the sheriff's ear didn't need to knock on anyone's door. He just walked through it, and the door swung open like it already knew better than to resist him. Ethan Caldwell was at the kitchen table when Crow stepped inside his home that January morning, trailing mud across the floorboards, one hand tucked into his coat, like a man who'd already won the argument he hadn't started yet. He looked around the room slowly, the way a buyer looks at livestock he intends to purchase below value. "You've got until the end of the month," Crow said. He didn't sit down. He didn't remove his hat. "After that, I take the water rights, the eastern pasture, and whatever's left of this place through the county court. You'll get what I offered. You won't get more." Ethan stood up from his chair. And in the corner of that kitchen, half hidden behind the door frame leading to the hall, a woman in a gray wool dress stood very still and watched Silas Crow with eyes that didn't blink. Her name was Margaret Ellis. She had been on this ranch for 11 days. She had come by mistake. And she was already the most dangerous person in that room. If you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, now is the time, because this story is only getting started, and you do not want to miss what happens next. Hit the like button, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to the beginning. But the train that carried Margaret Ellis into Bitter Creek, Montana, arrived 40 minutes late on a Thursday in late October, 1886, and it arrived in the middle of a wind that came down off the northern mountains like it had a personal grievance with everything below the tree line. Margaret stepped off onto the platform carrying a single leather satchel, a carpet bag that had seen better decades, and the expression of someone who had just made a decision she wasn't entirely sure about, but was committed to seeing through regardless. She was 31 years old. She had taught school in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania for 7 years. She had answered an advertisement in a weekly newspaper because the school where she worked had closed, because the man she'd almost married had chosen someone else, and because somewhere between those 2 losses she had looked at her small rented room and understood that staying in it was its own kind of dying. The advertisement had been placed by a Montana ranching agency that matched frontiermen with women willing to relocate for marriage. Margaret had read it 3 times before responding. The language was plain and practical. Experienced ranch woman preferred. Knowledge of livestock and land work a requirement. Widow or woman of settled temperament preferred. Reply with full particulars. She had replied honestly. She was not experienced with livestock. She had never worked a ranch. She was not a widow. What she had, she wrote, was 7 years of managing 20 children in a single room with limited supplies and no assistance, and she believed the organizational skills required for that work were transferable. She did not expect to be selected. The agency selected her anyway, though not for the reason she assumed. There had been a clerical error. 2 women had applied within the same week, a Margaret Ellis, schoolteacher, and a Martha Elliston, the widow of a Kansas cattle farmer with 15 years of ranch experience. The files had been mixed. The letter of confirmation had gone to the wrong woman. Margaret did not know this. Ethan Caldwell did not know this either. What Ethan knew, standing on that platform with his coat buttoned against the wind and his jaw set in the particular way it set when he was bracing for something he wasn't sure he wanted, was that the woman stepping off the train was not what he had pictured. He had pictured someone built for this country, someone whose hands already looked like they'd done the work, someone who would see the ranch and recognize it rather than need it explained to her. The woman walking toward him across the platform moved carefully, like she was paying attention to the ground beneath her feet. She was slight. Her coat was city-made, not warm enough for what was coming. Her face was... He searched for the word and settled uncomfortably on thoughtful. She looked like a person who noticed things. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, and put out her hand like she was meeting a colleague, not a man who'd paid an agency fee for a wife. He shook it. Her grip was firmer than he expected. "Miss Ellis." He looked at the satchel and the carpet bag. "Is that everything?" "Yes." He waited, in case there was more. There wasn't. "All right," he said, and picked up the carpet bag without asking, because it was the thing to do, and started toward the wagon. She followed. She didn't ask questions about the town or comment on the wind, or say anything about how different it was from Pennsylvania. He noticed that. Most people who came from the East couldn't stop comparing where they were to where they'd come from. She just walked beside him and looked at the mountains at the edge of the valley like she was trying to understand something about them. They were 20 minutes out of town, moving along the frozen road that cut between the dead grass pastures, before she spoke. "Your daughter," she said. "How old is she?" 8, Ethan said. "What's her name?" "Clara." A pause. "Does she know I'm coming?" "She does." "What did you tell her about me?" Ethan kept his eyes on the road. The horses knew it well enough. He barely had to guide them. "I told her the agency was sending a woman who knew ranch work, that she'd help run the house and learn the land." Another pause. Longer this time. "Mr. Caldwell," Margaret said carefully, "I want to be straightforward with you about something." He looked at her sideways. "I'm not experienced with ranch work. I taught school. I answered an advertisement because I believed I had skills that could transfer. Organization, managing a household, working with children. I was honest with the agency about all of that." She folded her hands in her lap. "I'm telling you now because I'd rather you know before we arrive than discover it after." Ethan pulled the horses to a slow halt in the middle of the empty road. He turned and looked at her directly for the first time since the platform. She held his gaze. She didn't apologize. She didn't look away or try to soften what she'd said. She just sat there and let him have whatever reaction he was going to have. "The agency told me you were experienced," he said. "Then the agency was mistaken," she said. "Or there was a mix-up. I don't know their records. I only know mine." He stared at her for a long moment. The wind moved through the grass on both sides of the road. The horses stood patiently. "I have a ranch to run," he said finally. "A daughter to raise. A winter coming that'll test everything I've got. I can't afford to be training someone from scratch." "I understand," Margaret said. "Do you?" "I do." She looked at the mountains again, then back at him. "I'm not asking you to be patient with incompetence. I'm asking you to give me enough time to show you what I can actually do. Those are different things." Ethan picked up the reins. He didn't say yes. He didn't say no. He clicked to the horses and they moved forward, and Margaret settled her hands in her lap again and didn't press him, which was, he would think later, the first sign that she understood something important about how to deal with a man like him. The Caldwell Ranch sat at the base of a long ridge, backed by pine timber and facing south across a valley that was beautiful in summer and punishing in winter. Ethan had built most of the main house himself, in the years after his wife Rebecca died. It was solid work, good timber, tight joints, a stone fireplace that drew properly, but it had the look of a place built by a man thinking about function and not much else. There were no curtains on the windows. The kitchen shelves were organized by practicality, not by any sense of care. The floor near the door had been tracked up and not thoroughly cleaned in what appeared to be several weeks. Clara was standing on the porch when the wagon pulled in. She was small for 8, dark-haired like her father, and she was watching the wagon with an intensity that didn't belong on a child's face. When Margaret climbed down, Clara looked at her the way children sometimes look at things they've been hoping for so long, they're afraid to believe it. Margaret walked up to the porch steps and stopped at the bottom, so she was looking slightly up at Clara rather than down at her. "I'm Margaret," she said. "I know," Clara said. "Papa told me." "He told me about you too." Clara glanced at her father, who had gone around to unharness the horses and had not come up to the house yet. Then she looked back at Margaret. "Can you make biscuits?" "I can," Margaret said. "Mama made biscuits on Sundays." Clara said it flatly, not as a comparison, just as a fact she felt needed to be stated. "Then I'll learn how she made them," Margaret said, "if you'll teach me." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she stepped back from the door and held it open. "You can come in," she said. "It's cold." The first week was harder than Margaret had let herself imagine it would be. The kitchen stove ran on a logic she had to learn from scratch. The water came from a pump that required a specific sequence. Prime it wrong, and you spent 20 minutes getting nothing. The supply of firewood needed to be managed, not just for warmth, but for cooking, for the stove, for the small iron heater in Clara's room, and the amount required per day was more than Margaret had estimated by roughly half. She made mistakes. She burned a pot of beans because she misjudged the stove's heat and got distracted mending a split in Clara's winter coat. She let the kitchen fire go low one night trying to stretch the wood supply and woke to pipes that had nearly frozen. She asked Ethan a question about the cattle rotation that she should have been able to answer herself after watching the morning chores, and she saw the quick flinch on his face. Not cruel, just involuntary. That told her he was recalibrating his patience. She didn't make excuses. What she did was take Ethan's record book from the shelf near the fireplace one evening after supper and read it, front to back. All of it. The cattle tallies, the supply logs, the seasonal notes he'd made over 8 years of working that land. She sat at the kitchen table after Clara was in bed and read until her eyes hurt, and then she closed the book and sat quietly for a while. Ethan came in from the barn around 9. He stopped when he saw the book on the table. "I should have asked," Margaret said. "I should have asked before I read it. I'm sorry for that." He stood in the doorway. "It's not private." "Still, I should have asked." She pushed the book toward the center of the table. "You've had 2 bad winters for hay yield. The eastern pasture didn't produce what you needed last year. You compensated by selling 3 head in November, which meant you went into January lighter than you wanted to be." Ethan said nothing. "The creek on the eastern boundary," Margaret continued. "Your notes say it ran low 2 summers ago. Did it recover last year?" He came the rest of the way into the kitchen. He pulled out a chair but didn't sit in it yet. "Mostly," he said. "Is that what Crow wants, the water?" A pause. "You know about Crow?" "I heard his name in town when we passed through. 2 different people mentioned him without me asking. That usually means something." Ethan sat down. He looked at the record book, then at her. "Silas Crow owns the valley north of here. He's been buying up water rights for 3 years. Every rancher who's struggled, bad season, debt, sickness, he's made an offer. Most of them took it. But you haven't." "This land is Clara's," he said. "Whatever else, it's hers." Margaret nodded slowly. Then, "How solid is your deed?" He frowned. "What do you mean, how solid?" "I mean, has anyone looked at it recently? Compared it to county records? Land claims on the frontier have a history of being contested on technicalities, especially when someone with resources decides to make an issue of them." Ethan stared at her. "You're a schoolteacher." "I'm a person who reads," she said, "and I've been reading your records. You have the deed. I'm asking whether it's been verified against current county records." He didn't answer right away. And the fact that he didn't answer right away told Margaret something important. "I'll look at it tomorrow," he said finally. "The deed." "Good," she said, and stood up to bank the fire for the night. "We should both sleep." The town of Bitter Creek had approximately 240 residents, depending on the season, and it had formed the particular opinion of Ethan Caldwell's new mail-order bride within approximately 48 hours of her arrival, which was roughly how long it took for the station master's wife to tell the dry goods proprietor's wife, who told the minister's wife, who told everyone else. The opinion was not unkind exactly. It was skeptical in the specific way that frontier communities were skeptical of people who arrived from the East without the right kind of experience. The general consensus, loosely translated from the various polite ways it was expressed, was that the schoolteacher from Pennsylvania was not going to last the winter. Hattie Drummond, who ran the town's small boarding house and had an opinion about everything and kept none of them to herself, stated it plainly to the 2 women who came for laundry pickup on that first Saturday. "She's a sweet thing, I'm sure. But sweet doesn't split wood, and that man needs someone who can split wood." The women nodded. None of them had met Margaret yet. Margaret met Hattie Drummond the following Wednesday when she came into town with Clara on the supply run. She was buying flour and salt and a length of oilcloth for the kitchen table when Hattie appeared in the doorway of the dry goods store and looked her over in the way that is technically not rude, but operates with all the social impact of a full inspection. "You're the bride," Hattie said. "I'm Margaret Ellis," Margaret said. "How do you do?" Hattie ignored the pleasantry. "You look like you teach school." "I did, for 7 years." "That's nice," Hattie said, with the tone of someone indicating that it was not especially relevant. "Winters here'll change you, if you stay." "I expect they will," Margaret said. She set the oilcloth on the counter for the proprietor to measure. "Which is why I'm trying to learn what I can now before the worst of it arrives." "What have you learned so far?" "That the stove needs to be checked before 6 in the morning or it burns off too hot. That the cattle in the northern pen need an extra ration when the temperature drops below a certain point. That your town's opinion of me was formed before I arrived." Hattie blinked. "I'm not bothered by it," Margaret said. Opinions change. Clara, standing beside Margaret, was watching Hattie with the focused attention of a child who had learned to read adult situations carefully. After a moment, she slipped her hand into Margaret's. Hattie looked at Clara's hand in Margaret's, and something shifted in her face. Not dramatically, just a small movement around the eyes. "Can you cook?" she asked. "Getting better," Margaret said honestly. Hattie made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh. "Come back Thursday," she said. "I'll show you how to do a proper venison stew, the kind that actually sticks to your bones. You're going to need it." The deed was in a tin box in the back of the bedroom closet, folded twice, the paper gone soft with age and handling. Ethan spread it on the kitchen table on a Sunday morning when the light was good. Margaret sat across from him. Clara had been sent to feed the chickens and had gone without argument, which told Ethan she understood something important was happening, because Clara always had arguments about chickens. They looked at the deed together. Ethan had looked at it many times. He knew what it said. He knew the boundary marks. The creek on the east, the ridge on the north, the survey markers that had been driven into the ground in 1871, 15 years ago. "This is the original grant," he said. "Yes," Margaret said. She was reading it carefully, more slowly than he had. "And the county re-recorded it in 1879? Standard process. They did the whole territory. Do you have the re-recording document?" He looked at her. "It should be with the deed." They both looked at the tin box. There was nothing else in it. Ethan felt something cold settle in his stomach. "It might be at the county office," he said. "Filed there." "It might be," Margaret agreed, "but it should have been returned to you after filing." He stopped. "Rebecca handled the filing in 79. He didn't finish the sentence. Rebecca had died in 1880. Whatever had happened with the 1879 re-recording, he had no memory of it, no record of it, and no way to ask her. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then, "The county office in Helena would have a copy. That's 4 days' ride." "I know." She looked at the deed again. "Crow has lawyers. If he's been planning this, he's already looked at your title chain. If there's a gap in it, even a technical one, even something that should have been a routine matter, he'll use it." She looked up. "You need to know what he has before he uses it on you." Ethan stood up. He walked to the window. He looked out at the land, the frozen pasture, the pine ridge, the sky that was going gray in the northwest, the way it did when weather was building. "I can't leave Clara for 4 days," he said. "No," Margaret said, "but I can go." He turned around. "I can read documents," she said. "I know what I'm looking for. I can make the ride." "I've never done a lot of things that I've now done," she said. "Teach me what I need to know about the horse and the route. I'll manage the rest." He stared at her. "You don't know me well enough to trust me with something like that," she said, acknowledging it directly. "I know that, but consider what your options are." The wind moved against the window. Somewhere out in the north pasture, one of the cattle made a sound that carried all the way to the house. Ethan looked at the deed on the table. He looked at the empty tin box. "There's one more thing," he said. He pulled out a chair and sat back down. "Before we talk about Helena, there's something I should tell you." Margaret waited. 3 weeks before I sent to the agency," he said, "Crow came to me, made his offer. I turned him down. He told me—" He paused. "He told me a man alone couldn't hold this land, that I'd come around eventually, because everyone comes around." He looked at his hands. "I sent to the agency partly because he was right that I was struggling. I needed help. But partly—" He stopped again. "Partly you wanted to show him he was wrong," Margaret said. Ethan didn't answer, which was an answer. "I understand that," she said. "That's a human reason. You don't need to be ashamed of it." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not quite gratitude, not quite surprise, somewhere between them. "The mistake," he said, "about who the agency sent. I need you to know that You expected someone else," Margaret said. "Someone more suited to what you needed. I know. You've been patient about it, more patient than you had to be." "I'm not sure patient's the right word," he said honestly. "It was patient enough," she said. "That's what matters." Clara came back in from the chickens then, cheeks red from the cold, carrying 2 eggs with the careful deliberateness of someone who has dropped eggs before and learned from it. 3 today, she announced. "Good," Ethan said. Clara set the eggs on the counter. She looked at the deed on the table, then at both of them, then at the deed again. "Is something wrong with the ranch?" she asked. "We're working on making sure nothing's wrong with it," Ethan said. Clara thought about this. "Is Margaret helping?" "Yes," Ethan said, after a beat that was slightly too long to be entirely convincing. "She is." Clara considered both of them one more time. Then she went to the stove to warm her hands, apparently satisfied. It was 3 days later that Crow came. Ethan had ridden out early to check the northern fence line, where something had been getting into the upper pasture, tracks in the snow that suggested either a large coyote or a small wolf, and either way the fence needed attention before any of the cattle drifted too close to the tree line. Margaret was in the kitchen with Clara, working through a reading lesson. Clara was bright but impatient. She could read well when she wanted to, but she wanted to be doing other things, and Margaret had learned that the way to keep her engaged was to let her choose the subject matter while Margaret chose the text. Today Clara had chosen horses, so they were reading from a farming almanac section on horse care, which was not exactly literature but was keeping Clara's attention in a way that Little Women had not. The sound of horses coming into the yard was not unusual. Margaret stood up and looked out the window. 3 horses. 4 men. A wagon behind them with a man on the seat she didn't recognize. The man at the front, heavy-set, well-dressed for the frontier, moving with the ease of someone accustomed to arriving places and being received as important. She hadn't met before, but she recognized the type. "Clara," she said, keeping her voice even, "go to your room and read ahead in the almanac." Clara looked out the window. She went still in the particular way children go still when they sense something adults don't want them to see. "Who is that?" she asked. "Someone here to see your father," Margaret said. "Go on." Clara went. The knock on the door was 3 hard raps. Not polite, not quite threatening, the knock of a man who was conducting business and considered social courtesies a waste of his time. Margaret opened the door. Silas Crow looked at her the way he looked at most things. An assessment, quick and complete, that arrived at evaluation. What he saw was a woman in an apron with ink on her fingers from the almanac, standing in a doorway that belonged to a ranch he'd already decided he was going to own. "Ethan Caldwell," he said. "Not here," Margaret said. "Can I help you?" Crow's eyes moved past her into the kitchen, around the room, back to her. "You're the teacher," he said, "the one the agency sent." "I'm Margaret Ellis," she said. "Mr. Caldwell will be back by midday. You're welcome to wait in town or come back then." "I'll wait," he said, and walked in. She didn't step back fast enough, or rather, she didn't step back at all. And for a moment they were close in the doorway, and she could smell the cold off his coat and something underneath it that was expensive and out of place and deliberate. He moved past her. He looked around the kitchen, the deed tin on the shelf. She noticed his eyes go there, and her stomach tightened. And then he pulled out a chair at the table and sat down, without being invited, with the complete comfort of a man sitting in furniture he's already mentally claimed. "Nice place," he said. "Could use some work." Margaret remained standing near the door. She kept her face still. "Coffee?" she asked, because she had been raised to offer hospitality, even when every instinct she had was running in another direction, and also because it would give her something to do with her hands. "Please," he said, with the politeness of a man who'd learned that polite cost nothing and made people underestimate him. She moved to the stove. She was aware of him watching her. She was aware that he was noting everything in the room, the same way she had noted everything about him in the first 10 seconds. "You know why I'm here," he said. Not a question. "You've made offers on the land," she said. "Mr. Caldwell has declined." "He's declined so far," Crow said. "That tends to change." "Does it?" "In my experience, yes." He leaned back in the chair. A man alone, fighting a Montana winter, trying to run a cattle operation with a child to raise and no second income. Eventually the math becomes clear to him. Margaret poured coffee. She brought it to the table. She did not sit down. "Mr. Caldwell isn't alone," she said. Crow looked up at her. "He has help now," she said. "Household is running. Supply management is better than it was. He's not carrying it by himself anymore." A pause. "You think you changed the math," he said. "I think the situation is different than it was when you last assessed it," she said. He smiled. It was not unfriendly. That was the thing about Crow she was already seeing. He was not cruel in the theatrical way, not sneering, not enjoying his own power in any obvious manner. He was simply certain. Certainty was his weapon. He had been right about so many things in so many negotiations for so many years that the possibility of being wrong had ceased to feel real to him. "I'm going to be straightforward with you," he said, "because I think you're a sensible woman and I have respect for sensible people." He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. "That land claim has a gap in it. The 1879 re-recording was never completed properly. Under territorial law, a claim that was never properly re-recorded reverts to available status after a period of non-resolution. My lawyers have been patient. That period expires in 32 days. Margaret kept her face still. Inside her chest, something that was not quite fear and not quite anger was doing something complicated. 32 days, she said. I'm offering Ethan a fair price, better than what the county would compensate after a legal proceeding. He drank from the cup, set it down. Tell him that. Tell him I came with patience, not a threat. The offer stands for 2 weeks. After that, the lawyers handle it. He stood. He buttoned his coat. You seem like a smart woman, he said at the door. Smart enough to understand that frontier sentiment doesn't win in territorial court. Documents win. Yes, Margaret said. They do. He left. She didn't move until she heard the horses leave the yard. Then she walked to the window and watched the wagon until it was out of sight around the bend in the road. Clara appeared in the hallway doorway. Who was that man? She asked. Someone with a problem, Margaret said. What kind of problem? Margaret turned away from the window. She looked at Clara, this small, careful, watchful child who had learned to read adult rooms out of survival, who had lost her mother and was in the process of deciding whether the woman her father had sent for was someone worth trusting. The kind, Margaret said, that we're going to solve. She went to the shelf. She took down the deed tin. She opened it and looked at the empty space beside the deed for a long moment. Then she sat down at the kitchen table with Ethan's record book, a piece of paper, and a pen, and she started writing down everything Crow had said, in exact order, with the exact words, before any of it could fade. She was still writing when Ethan came through the door at noon. He stopped when he saw her face. Crow was here, he said. He was. She set down the pen. Ethan, we have 32 days and we need to go to Helena. Ethan read what Margaret had written before he even took off his coat. He stood in the doorway, still smelling of cold air and horse and pine needles, and he read every word she'd put down, Crow's exact sentences, the timeline, the specific legal claim about the 1879 re-recording, and his face did something that Margaret had not seen it do before. It went very still. Not the stillness of a man controlling his anger, but the stillness of a man absorbing a blow he'd half expected for a long time, and had hoped, against better judgment, would never actually land. He set the paper down on the table. He pulled out a chair and sat. 32 days, he said. That's what he told me. Ethan pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. It was an unguarded gesture, the kind a man makes when he forgets someone is watching or when he's too tired to remember to hold himself together. He stayed that way for a moment. Then he dropped his hands and looked at the deed, which Margaret had left open on the table beside her notes. Rebecca handled everything in 79, he said. I was running the cattle through a bad summer. She said she'd take the re-recording into town. I didn't follow up. He stopped. I should have followed up. You didn't know it would matter, Margaret said. I should have followed up anyway. She didn't argue with that. Some things were true and needed to be said, and the kindest response was not to soften them, but to let them land and move on. The question now is, what's at the county office in Helena? Whether the re-recording exists in their files, even if your copy was never returned. That's still possible. And if it doesn't exist, then we have a different problem. But let's find out what we have before we decide what we're fighting. Ethan looked at her. You said we. Yes, she said. I did. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up, moving around the corners of the house with that particular pitch that meant the temperature was dropping. Clara's footsteps moved across the ceiling above them. She'd gone up to her room after Crow left and hadn't come back down, which meant she was either reading or lying on her bed staring at the ceiling in the way she did when something was bothering her. I can't leave the ranch for 4 days, Ethan said. Not right now. The north fence has a break in 3 places. I've got cattle that'll drift if I don't watch the upper pasture, and there's weather coming in tonight that I don't like the look of. I know, Margaret said. I'm not suggesting you go. He looked at her steadily. Margaret, I can make the ride. You said the route to Helena is straightforward once you're through the pass. You can give me the landmark points, and I'll keep notes as I go. You've been on a horse for a total of, 4 days? 6, she said. I've been practicing in the mornings before you're up. He stared at her. What? The gray mare. She's patient. I've been taking her around the south pasture every morning at first light. I won't pretend I'm skilled, but I can manage a road. Ethan's expression moved through several things in quick succession. Surprise, disbelief, something that might have been reluctant respect, and then back to concern. The pass in late October. I'll carry what I need. You tell me what. It's not just the weather, he said. 4 days alone on that route, a woman traveling solo. There are men who... I know what kind of men there are, Margaret said evenly. I'm not naive about it. I'm not suggesting you are. Then stop treating the risk as a reason I can't go rather than a reason I need to be careful. She held his gaze. Ethan, you told me Clara's inheritance is on this land. You told me that's what you're holding it for, so let me help you hold it. The fire settled in the grate. A log shifted and sent up a small shower of sparks. Ethan looked at his hands, at the deed, at her. There's a man named Garrett Walsh who runs freight between here and Helena, he said finally. He makes the trip every 2 weeks. He's leaving Thursday morning. He paused. He's honest. He knows me. I could send word tonight and ask him to let you ride with the wagon. Margaret felt something loosen in her chest. That would be better. It would also mean you're gone for close to a week, maybe 8 days. I know. Clara will miss me, Margaret said. That's all right. It means something's been established. He looked at her with that expression again, the one between gratitude and something he hadn't named yet. You've been here 3 weeks, he said. I know how long I've been here. I'm not... He stopped, started again. I'm saying I notice that it hasn't been long and you're already talking about this place like... He stopped again. Like I plan to stay, she said. He didn't answer, but something in his face changed. She left Thursday before sunrise. Garrett Walsh was a large, weathered man of about 50 who had the comfortable manner of someone who had spent most of his adult life moving between places and had no strong attachment to any of them. He asked no unnecessary questions. When Ethan introduced Margaret and explained briefly that she was riding to Helena on ranch business, Garrett nodded and said there was room on the bench seat and they'd make the first waypoint by nightfall if the weather held. The weather held. Barely. The first day was gray and biting, the pass swept by wind that came in diagonal sheets that stung the face and made conversation difficult, which suited both of them. Margaret kept her scarf up and her hands in her pockets and watched the country move past and thought about territory law. She had spent the 2 days before leaving reading everything she could find. Ethan had a law compendium from 1878, not specific to Montana, but containing general territorial land statutes, and she had gone through the relevant sections 3 times, making notes in the margin of her own notebook. She understood the basic problem. A land claim in the territory required a valid chain of title, which meant every transfer and re-recording had to exist in the county register. A gap in the chain was not automatically fatal to the claim, but it created a vulnerability that a well-resourced challenger could exploit in territorial court. Crow's lawyers would argue the gap meant the claim was unresolved. Without the re-recording on file, Ethan's deed became, legally speaking, uncertain. Uncertain was enough for Crow. On the second day, when the road leveled out below the pass and the wind dropped enough for conversation, Garrett Walsh said, without preamble, "You're the woman Ethan Caldwell brought in from the east." "I am," Margaret said. "Good man," Garrett said. "Rough few years." "Yes," she said. "Crow's been circling him a while." Garrett kept his eyes on the road. The horses knew it well and needed minimal guidance. "He does that. Waits. Lets things get hard enough that people just want it to end." "Does it usually work?" "Often enough that he keeps doing it." Margaret turned to look at the country to the south. Open grassland running toward a line of low hills, pale and enormous and indifferent to all of them. Do you know anyone who's pushed back successfully? Garrett thought about it. Ed Hartwell. Had a water dispute with Crow 3 years back. But Hartwell had cash and connections in Helena, so that was different. He paused. Most people don't have what Hartwell had. What does Ethan have? Garrett looked at her sideways. Something in his face shifted slightly. Right now? He's got you, apparently. She didn't respond to that. She looked back at the road. I'm going to the county office to find a document, she said. Either it's there or it isn't. That's the whole thing. And if it isn't? Then I find out what else is there, she said. Something usually is. Helena was larger than Margaret had expected. A proper frontier city, with paved main streets and brick buildings, and the particular energy of a place where money and ambition were both actively in motion. The county records office was in a 2-story stone building at the end of the civic block, staffed by a clerk named Howard Pell, who wore spectacles and had the look of a man who had been in that office for approximately his entire adult life and had formed a comprehensive opinion about everyone who walked through the door. He formed an opinion about Margaret within about 30 seconds. Montana Territory Land Office records, she said. I need the 1879 re-recording files for Caldwell Ranch, Jefferson County Range Section. Pell looked at her over his spectacles. You representing someone? I'm acting on behalf of Ethan Caldwell. The ranch is his. And you're Margaret Ellis. I'm associated with the Caldwell household. She kept her voice even and professional, the voice she'd used with school board members and parents who'd underestimated her. The re-recording should have been filed in the fall of 1879. There may also be a correspondence record related to it. I need to see everything in the file. Pell looked at her for another moment. Then he turned and disappeared into the back room. She waited. The office smelled of old paper and lamp oil, and the particular dusty, dry smell of documents that hadn't been touched in a long time. Someone had stacked files on every available surface. The shelves ran floor to ceiling on 2 walls, organized by what appeared to be year and county, though the system showed signs of having been interrupted and restarted several times. Pell came back after 12 minutes, she counted, carrying a folder that was thinner than she wanted it to be. Caldwell, he said. He opened the folder on the counter. 1879 re-recording, filed October 14th, 1879. Margaret felt the breath go out of her, slowly and quietly, like something that had been wound tight for 3 days, carefully releasing. It's there, she said. It's there, Pell confirmed. He turned the document so she could see it. Properly filed, stamped, registered. You have a copy return issue? The copy was apparently never returned to the ranch. We only have the original deed. That happens. He pulled out a ledger from below the counter. I can issue a certified copy. Takes about an hour. There's a fee. I'll pay it, Margaret said. I also need to ask about something else. Pell looked up. Is there any record of a challenge to this claim? Any notation of a competing filing? Anything associated with the name Crow, Silas Crow, or Crow Land Holdings? Pell's expression did something careful and slow. He looked at the folder. He looked at her. I'm not at liberty to discuss other parties' filings, he said. I'm not asking you to disclose their specifics, Margaret said. I'm asking whether there is any active challenge filed against this claim. That's a matter of record, a matter of public record. A pause. There's a notation, Pell said. He didn't touch the folder. He just looked at it. Filed last month, a notice of competing interest. Margaret's hands were flat on the counter. She kept them still. From whom? Crow Land Holdings, Pell said. Territory filing claims procedural deficiency in the original chain of title. Based on the missing re-recording copy. I'm not in a position to... Based on the missing re-recording copy, Margaret said again, not a question this time. Pell was quiet for a moment. Then he said quietly, the re-recording is on file. It's stamped. It's valid. Anyone who reviewed this file before filing that notice would have seen it. Margaret looked at him. That's an interesting observation, she said carefully. It's a factual one, he said. He closed the folder. I'll get your certified copy. Sit down if you like. She didn't sit down. She stood at the counter and thought about what Pell had just told her. Not what he'd said, but the shape of it. Crow's lawyers had filed a notice of competing interest based on a claim of procedural deficiency. The procedural deficiency they claimed was the missing re-recording, But the re-recording existed. It was here, in this office, stamped and registered and perfectly valid, which meant one of two things. Either Crow's lawyers had filed the notice without checking the records, which was the kind of incompetence that cost money and didn't make sense for a man like Crow, or they had checked the records, seen the re-recording, and filed the notice anyway, betting that Ethan wouldn't know the re-recording existed, wouldn't come to Helena to verify it, and would either accept Crow's offer before the deadline or walk into a territorial court proceeding without knowing he had the document that made the entire competing claim collapse. She stood very still at the counter and understood that she was looking at something deliberate. Crow hadn't just been opportunistic. He had designed this. She was back in Bitter Creek 8 days after she left, arriving on a Tuesday afternoon with the certified copy of the re-recording in her satchel and 2 additional documents she'd obtained from Pell after 2 more hours of careful, methodical conversation in which she'd established that Crow's notice of competing interest was not only built on a false premise, but had been filed using a procedural format that had been superseded by an 1882 territorial revision, meaning it was, strictly speaking, not valid under current law. Pell had told her that in the careful, uninflected tone of a man who was doing his job and had perhaps, in doing his job, developed a certain quiet view of the parties involved in this particular matter. She'd thanked him sincerely. She'd meant it. Ethan was at the fence line when she rode in with Garrett's wagon, and Clara was the one who came running across the yard, which surprised Margaret more than she'd expected it to. The girl had her coat half-buttoned and her hair loose, and she stopped about 3 feet short of where Margaret was climbing down from the wagon bench, as if she'd started running without deciding what she was going to do when she got there. "You came back," Clara said. "I said I would," Margaret said. "Papa said you probably would." Clara looked at her shoes. "I wasn't sure." Margaret crouched down so she was at Clara's eye level. "I came back with what we needed," she said. "Everything's going to be all right." Clara looked up. Something worked in her face, something private and young and complicated, the expression of a child who has been disappointed before and has learned to be careful about hope. She reached out and took Margaret's hand and held it for a moment, then let go and turned and went back toward the house. Margaret stood up slowly. Garrett Walsh, on the wagon bench above her, made no comment. He was a man who understood when something had happened that didn't require words. Ethan came in from the fence at dusk. The temperature had dropped 10 degrees since noon, and the sky in the north was going the color of old pewter. He came through the kitchen door and stopped. The table was set. There was venison stew, Hattie Drummond's recipe, which Margaret had made twice now and was getting right. And the lamp was lit, and Clara was already in her chair, and Margaret was at the stove with her back to him, and for a moment he just stood in the doorway and looked at it. "Sit down," Margaret said without turning around. "The stew's done." He sat. She brought the pot to the table and ladled out 3 bowls and sat across from him. Clara immediately reached for her bread. Ethan started to say something, and Margaret reached into her satchel, which was hanging on the back of her chair, and set the certified copy on the table in front of him. He looked at it. He looked at her. "It was there," she said. "Filed October 1879. Stamped and registered." Ethan picked up the document. His hands were not entirely steady. He read it twice, slowly, the way he'd read her notes about Crow's visit, absorbing it line by line, making sure it was real. "The copy was never sent back," he said. "No, but it's valid, and there's more." She set the second document beside the first. "Crow's attorneys filed a notice of competing interest last month, based on the claim that your re-recording was missing." Ethan stared at her. "They filed it knowing the re-recording was on file," she said. "The clerk confirmed it's been there since 1879. Anyone reviewing the record before filing would have seen it." A silence. "He knew," Ethan said. "His lawyers knew. Yes." Clara had stopped eating. She was watching both of them with the focused attention of a child who understood that something important was being said, even if she didn't have all the words for it. "So he lied," Clara said. Margaret looked at her. "Yes," she said. "About our land. About the legal standing of your land. He claimed there was a problem with the paperwork, knowing the paperwork was actually fine." Clara turned to look at her father. "Papa," she said, with the gravity of an 8-year-old who has just processed something that requires a response. "That's wrong." "Yes," Ethan said. He set the document down carefully. "It is." He looked at Margaret. The lamplight was doing something to the room, making it warmer than it actually was, making the shadows in the corners seem less present, making the four walls of that kitchen feel, briefly, like enough. "How do we use this?" he said. "The notice he filed is also procedurally flawed," Margaret said. "The format he used was superseded in 1882. It's not valid under current territorial law. I have the relevant statute citation." She set the third document on the table. "If he brings this to territorial court, his own filing will undermine his case. His lawyers presumably know this, which may be why he's pushing the personal offer rather than going straight to legal proceedings. He needs you to settle before anyone looks closely at what he actually filed." Ethan looked at the three documents arranged on the table, at the stew going slightly cold in his bowl, at his daughter watching him with her chin propped on her fist. "So if I take this to a lawyer in Helena, his claim falls apart," Margaret said. "He has no legal ground. He's been operating on the assumption that you wouldn't know that." The fire settled. The wind moved against the north wall of the house. Outside, the temperature was still dropping, and somewhere across the pasture the cattle were bunched together the way they did when the cold got serious. Ethan picked up his spoon. He looked at the stew. He looked up at Margaret with an expression she had no word for yet. "You went to Helena and came back with 3 documents that dismantle a land grab that a man with lawyers and money has been building for months," he said. "Yes," she said. "You're a schoolteacher from Pennsylvania." "I was," she said. "I'm not sure what I am now." Something moved in his face. Not quite a smile, not yet, not from a man who'd been bracing against things for 3 years, but the beginning of one. The suggestion of it. The place where one might eventually grow. "Eat your stew," Clara said to both of them. "It's getting cold." The problem was that legal victory on paper and actual safety on the ground were not the same thing, and Margaret understood that within about 2 days of being back at the ranch. The certified copy was in the tin box now beside the original deed. The documents were real, the argument was sound, but Silas Crow still had 3 lawyers and a territorial court filing and 32 days, now down to 24. And he also had, as Margaret was beginning to understand, a secondary strategy that didn't depend on winning in court at all. She first noticed it when she went into town for supplies on Thursday. 3 people she'd been on speaking terms with looked away. Hattie Drummond was behind the counter at her boarding house and met Margaret's eyes, but didn't come outside when Margaret came up the steps, which was different from the week before, when Hattie had waved her in for coffee and spent 30 minutes showing her how to get a proper crust on a venison pie. At the dry goods, a man named Aldous Finch, who'd traded pleasantries with Margaret twice before, made a point of turning to talk to someone else when she walked in. She paid for her supplies and loaded them into the wagon and drove back to the ranch with the particular flat expression of a person cataloging information. That evening, she told Ethan what she'd noticed. He sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and was quiet for a while. "Crow talks to people," he said finally. "When he wants something, he makes it easier for people to side with him than not to." "What does he tell them?" "Probably that he'll be the biggest landholder in the valley by spring regardless. That trading with someone who's about to be run off their land is bad business." Ethan turned his coffee cup in his hands. "He doesn't threaten people directly. He just makes the future he wants seem inevitable, and then people start acting like it already happened." Margaret thought about that. "He isolates you," she said. "He isolates me," Ethan said. "Same as he did when Rebecca died. Same as he did last winter when the hay was short. Waits until you're worn thin, and then makes sure no one around you is offering anything that might help you hold on. He's doing it again, to both of us now." Ethan looked at her. "You noticed it faster than I did." "I'm not tired yet," she said simply. "You've been fighting this for 3 years. Tired people miss things." He didn't say anything to that, but his jaw worked slightly, the way it did when something landed. "What would help?" she asked. "Not the legal problem. That's handled. What would actually help you hold this through the next 3 weeks until we can get that notice formally challenged?" Ethan looked at the table. "People," he said. "Other ranchers seeing that the claim is stable, that Crow doesn't have what he says he has. Can you call a meeting, get the Valley ranchers together?" He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "I'm not a meeting man." "I know, but I am." She looked at him levelly. "Let me do it." He stared at her. "Margaret, I organize school board meetings, parent assemblies. I convinced 12 farmers in Lancaster County to cooperate on a shared equipment purchase when half of them wouldn't speak to the other half. She kept her voice steady. I know how to get people in a room and keep them there long enough to show them something useful. These aren't Lancaster County farmers. No, they're people who understand land and water and the cost of a bad season, which means they also understand exactly what Crow is doing to them by making sure this county's water ends up under one man's control. She looked at him steadily. Let me talk to them. Ethan was quiet for a long time. Clara had come down from her room and was sitting on the bottom stair in the hallway, which she did sometimes when she wanted to listen without being seen. Margaret could see her small, wool-socked feet on the bottom step through the doorway. All right, Ethan said at last, but I'll come with you. Good, Margaret said. It'll go better with both of us. What makes you say that? Because they trust you. They've known you for years, and I'll show them the documents. She paused. People believe what they can see. We'll let them see everything. From the hallway, barely audible, Clara said, I want to come too. Ethan looked toward the stairs. You're 8. I know what he's trying to do, Clara said. I understood it at supper. If I understood it, so will the other farmers. Margaret looked at Ethan. He looked back at her. Neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was that the child was not wrong. Saturday, Ethan said. We'll go Saturday, starting with the Harmon place. Margaret nodded. She was already composing what she was going to say. The Harmon place was 6 miles north of the Caldwell Ranch, up a road that turned mean in wet weather and was currently doing its best impression of frozen mud, which was worse than either condition individually because it looked solid and wasn't. Ethan drove. Margaret sat beside him on the wagon bench with the documents in her satchel between her feet, and Clara sat in the back wrapped in a blanket Hattie Drummond had given her, watching the country go past with the self-contained patience of a child who had learned that asking, "Are we there?" yet produced no useful results. They didn't talk much on the ride up. Ethan had told her the night before what he knew about the Harmon family. Walt Harmon, 61, had been in the valley since 1868, ran cattle and a small hay operation, was not a man who liked surprises or people who talked too much. His wife Dora had died 4 years ago. He had 2 grown sons who helped with the work, and neither of whom trusted anyone they hadn't known for at least a decade. He's going to look at me and decide I don't belong here before I say a word, Margaret said. Probably, Ethan said, and you're not going to fix that for me. No. If I smooth it over, it won't stick. He kept his eyes on the road. Walt has to decide for himself. She appreciated the honesty, even though it made the ride less comfortable. Walt Harmon was in his yard when they pulled in, splitting wood with the mechanical efficiency of a man who had split so much wood in his life that his body did it without consulting his mind. He stopped when he saw the wagon. He looked at Ethan. He looked at Margaret. He looked at Clara. He set his axe in the chopping block and waited for them to come to him because it was his yard, and that was how it worked. Ethan, he said. Walt. Ethan climbed down. They shook hands the way men shake hands when they've known each other long enough that the handshake is mostly a formality, acknowledging shared history. This is Margaret Ellis. She's with my household. Walt looked at her. He had the kind of face that had been weathered past the point of hiding anything, which meant you could read him directly. He was skeptical, not unfriendly, and waiting to be shown something worth his time. I've heard about you, he said to Margaret. I expect you have, she said. Most of what you've heard is probably either wrong or incomplete. I'm hoping to correct that. Walt looked at Ethan. She always talked like that? More or less, Ethan said. Walt made a sound in his chest that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite approval, but was something between them. He picked up his axe and set it against the woodpile. Come inside, he said. It's cold. The Harmon house was a larger version of what the Caldwell house had been before Margaret started working on it. Functional, clean enough, thoroughly absent of any decorative impulse. Walt's oldest son, a heavy-set man named Carl, who had his father's eyes and none of his patience, was at the kitchen table when they came in and looked up with the specific wariness of someone expecting a sales pitch. Margaret sat down at the table and opened her satchel and put the 3 documents in front of Walt before she said a single word about why she was there. Walt looked at the documents. He looked at her. What am I looking at? The re-recording of the Caldwell land claim, filed 1879, stamped and registered at the Helena County office. A notice of competing interest filed against that claim last month by Crow Land Holdings, claiming the re-recording was missing, and the territorial statute revision from 1882 that renders Crow's filing procedurally invalid. She kept her hands folded on the table. Crow told Ethan he had 32 days to sell before the lawyers took over. His legal filing is built on a false premise and uses an outdated procedural format. His case has no standing. Walt read the first document slowly. He was the kind of man who actually read things rather than skimming them, which Margaret had hoped for. Carl leaned over his father's shoulder and read too. Nobody spoke for about 4 minutes. Then Walt sat back in his chair. He filed this knowing the re-recording was on file, he said. Not a question. The clerk at the Helena office confirmed the document has been there since 1879. Anyone conducting a proper title search would have found it before filing. Walt looked at Ethan. He's been doing this to you on purpose. Yes, Ethan said. And you think he's doing it to others? Walt said this looking at Margaret, because he understood she was the one who'd thought through the larger shape of it. I think he's been buying up water rights for 3 years through a combination of genuine distress purchases and manufactured uncertainty, she said. If a rancher believes his title is insecure, he becomes far more willing to sell. You don't need a real legal problem to create that outcome. You just need the man to believe there might be one. Carl straightened up. He looked at his father. Ed Pritchard sold last spring, he said. Remember, he was talking about some document issue before he sold. Walt's face went still. John Merkel the year before, Ethan said quietly. He told me he'd found an irregularity in his chain of title. I didn't ask details. I should have. The kitchen was quiet. The stove ticked. Outside, through the window, Margaret could see Clara in the yard, walking along the fence line with her hands in her pockets, looking at the snow. What do you want from me? Walt said. I want you to let me look at your deed, Margaret said. And your re-recording, if you have it. I want to know whether Crow's lawyers have already been working your title, and I want you to come to a meeting. What meeting? The one I'm going to organize. Every rancher in this valley who's had any conversation with Crow about land or water rights in the past 3 years. I want them all in the same room looking at the same information. Walt looked at her for a long time. How was a man who took his time arriving at decisions and didn't apologize for it? Margaret waited. Ethan waited. Even Carl waited, which cost him something, she could tell. My deed and recording are in the back, Walt finally said. Carl, get the tin. Walt's re-recording was there. His copy had been returned, unlike Ethan's, but tucked behind it was a letter on Crow Land Holdings stationery that made Margaret go very still when she read it. It was dated 8 weeks ago, written in the careful language of lawyers, doing something slightly outside the lines while maintaining plausible deniability. A friendly inquiry into whether Walt had ever verified the exact survey coordinates of his eastern boundary, given that recent reviews of historical records had revealed some potential discrepancies in that area of the county. There were no discrepancies. She could tell that from the deed in front of her. But the letter was designed to plant a seed, to make Walt wonder, to cost him sleep, and eventually, if the wondering went on long enough, to make the idea of selling seem like the end of a problem rather than the beginning of a loss. Walt read the letter again after Margaret set it down. I got that in September, he said. I thought he was just sniffing around. He was, Margaret said. This is how he sniffs. He doesn't come at you directly at first. He just makes you uncertain. She looked at Ethan, then back at Walt. Do you know who else got one of these? Walt and Carl exchanged a look. Bud Sears, Carl said. He mentioned something like it at the feed store. I didn't put it together. Anyone else? Pete Halverson, maybe, Walt said slowly. His wife said he'd been worried about something with the land. Wouldn't say what. Margaret wrote the names in her notebook. The meeting, she said. Can I use your place? You've been here longer than anyone. If it's here, more people will come. Walt looked at the letter on the table. He looked at his deed. He looked at Ethan. Saturday week, he said. I'll send word to Sears and Halverson. You talk to the others. Thank you, Margaret said. Don't thank me yet, Walt said. Crow's going to find out. He always does. I know, she said. I'm counting on it. Walt looked at her with the particular expression of a man recalibrating something he thought he'd already figured out. You got a plan for when he does? The beginning of one, she said honestly. He nodded slowly. That was, she was learning, the frontier version of that'll do for now. They visited 4 more ranches before the week was out. At the Sears place, Bud Sears showed them a letter nearly identical to Walt's, dated a week later, and his wife June stood in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed and said, "I told him it was trouble. I told him in September." Bud had the sheepish look of a man who hadn't listened to his wife about something he now wished he had, and June had the look of a woman who was going to remember this for a considerable time. At Pete Halverson's, the situation was worse. Pete was a quiet man, mid-40s, with the perpetual slightly startled expression of someone who'd been handed more than he'd expected out of life, and was still adjusting. He'd received not 1 letter, but 3, each successive one slightly more pointed than the last, and the third had included a reference to a specific line in his original 1874 land grant that Crow's lawyers claimed was improperly transcribed. Margaret looked at the 1874 grant. The transcription was fine. She told Pete that. He looked at the document and then at her and said, "I've been worried about that for 2 months," in the tone of a man setting down something very heavy. His wife, Nora, who was holding a baby on her hip and had been listening from the kitchen doorway, said, "Thank the stars. He hasn't slept right since October." "I should have gone to Helena myself," Pete said. "You had a new baby and a cattle operation to run," Margaret said. "Crow counted on that." At the Birch Creek homestead, which belonged to a widow named Agnes Tully, who ran her land with the help of her teenage son and a hired hand who was 70 if he was a day, Margaret found something that stopped her cold in the middle of a sentence. Agnes Tully had already signed a preliminary purchase agreement with Crow Land Holdings. It was on the kitchen table when they sat down, pushed to the side but visible, and Agnes looked at it the way people look at things they've done that they're not sure were right. She was 53, sharp-eyed, with the economical manner of a woman who had raised a child and maintained a homestead alone for 6 years and did not waste words or motion. "I signed it 4 days ago," she said. "He gave me 2 weeks to decide on the full contract." Ethan said nothing. Margaret kept her face still. "Can I see it?" Margaret asked. Agnes pushed it across the table. Margaret read it carefully. The price was under market. Not insultingly so. Crow was too smart for that. But under. The terms included a provision that Agnes would vacate within 60 days of final signing, which was winter, which meant moving a household and livestock operation in the worst possible conditions. And buried in the 3rd page, in the careful language of a document written to obscure its own implications, was a clause that waived Agnes's right to any future claim on the water access that ran through the southwestern corner of her property. "Agnes," Margaret said, "the water clause on page 3. If you sign the final contract, you permanently waive any claim on the creek access. That access also serves the Sears property to your south and the old McPherson parcel to the west. Once Crow owns your water rights, he controls access for everyone downstream." Agnes looked at her son, who was 17 and sitting at the corner of the table with his hands folded and his eyes on the document. He looked back at his mother. "I needed the money," Agnes said quietly. "The hay yield was bad. I've got a loan payment in February." "How much is the loan?" Margaret asked. Agnes told her. Margaret looked at Ethan. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's manageable." Agnes looked at him. "Ethan, between me and Walt Harmon and Bud Sears, that's manageable," he said, "if you're willing." "I'm not a charity case," Agnes said, and her voice had an edge that was not anger but something adjacent to it. The pride of a woman who had managed alone for 6 years and intended to keep managing. "No," Ethan said. "You're a neighbor. That's different." A long silence. Agnes's son said quietly, "Mama, the creek." Agnes looked at the document, at her son, at Ethan, at Margaret. "I haven't signed the final contract," she said. "No," Margaret said. "The preliminary. Is that binding?" "I'm not a lawyer," Margaret said carefully, "but the preliminary says subject to review of final terms. If you decline the final contract, the preliminary is voided." She paused. "You should confirm that with someone who has formal legal training, but that's what the language says." Agnes sat back in her chair. She looked at the ceiling for a moment, not at anything in particular, just away from all of them, taking the space she needed. Saturday week, she finally said. Walt Harmon's place? Yes, Margaret said. I'll be there. What? The meeting was on a Saturday morning with 6 inches of new snow on the ground and a sky that couldn't decide if it was finished or just resting. 11 people came to Walt Harmon's kitchen. That was more than Margaret had expected. Walt and Carl, Bud and June Sears, Pete and Nora Halverson, Agnes Tully, and her son Thomas, a man named Roy Birch, who'd had no contact with Crow directly but whose land bordered Halverson's, and 2 brothers named Deacon and Sam Pryor, who ran sheep on the valley's western edge and had been watching the water rights situation with the alert attention of people who understood exactly what consolidated water control meant for anyone downstream. And Ethan, and Margaret, and Clara, who sat in the corner next to Thomas Tully and drew pictures in a small notebook while the adults talked, which was exactly what Margaret had told her she could do and exactly how Clara had agreed to behave, and which lasted for approximately the first 20 minutes before Clara set down her pencil and began paying careful attention to everything being said. Margaret stood at the front of the room near Walt's fireplace with the documents spread on the sideboard beside her and talked for 20 minutes without stopping, which was longer than she'd planned but shorter than she'd feared. She explained the re-recording issue, what Crow's filing claimed, what the documents actually showed, and what the 1882 procedural revision meant for the validity of his legal approach. She showed them the letters, Walt's, Bud's, Pete's, and let the room absorb the pattern. She did not editorialize. She presented the information the way she had once presented arithmetic to a room of children. Here is what is true. Here is how you verify it. Here is what follows from it. The room was quiet through most of it. Frontier people listened differently than city people. They didn't fill silences with reactions. They just absorbed things, and you couldn't always tell what they were making of it until they were ready to tell you. When she finished, Roy Birch said, "So his legal filing is no good." "Under current territorial law, no," Margaret said. "But he doesn't know we know that." "He may not know yet. He will know soon. These things move." "So what does he do when he finds out?" "He adjusts," Margaret said. "He's a practical man. If the legal route is closed, he looks for another approach." "Which is what?" June Sears asked. "I don't know yet," Margaret said. "That's honest. I know what he's done. I don't know yet exactly what he'll do next." Deacon Pryor, who hadn't spoken yet, said from his chair near the window, "He'll come harder. That's what men like that do. When the soft approach closes, they don't give up. They just stop being soft about it." Several people in the room shifted. "He's right," Ethan said. It was the first thing he'd said since the introductions. He'd been standing near the kitchen doorway, and the room noticed when he spoke because he hadn't spoken before. "Crow doesn't lose gracefully. He didn't when Ed Pritchard pushed back 3 years ago. He won that one eventually, but it wasn't clean." "What happened to Pritchard?" Agnes asked. "Cattle started dying," Ethan said flatly. "Nothing you could prove. 2 fence breaks that weren't weather. A hay storage fire that took his winter supply in November." He looked around the room. "He sold in December." The room was very quiet. Sam Pryor said what several people were clearly thinking. "So we're talking about organizing against a man who's willing to hurt people's livelihoods." "Yes," Margaret said, "and your position is that we should do it anyway." "My position," Margaret said carefully, "is that you're already in it, all of you. The letters, the preliminary agreements, the manufactured uncertainty about your title chains." Crow's already put his hand in. "The question isn't whether to be in this situation. The question is whether you face it separately, one at a time, which is how he wins, or together, which changes his calculations." The room absorbed this. Pete Halverson, who had barely slept in 2 months over a land claim that didn't exist, looked at the documents on the sideboard and said, "What do we do?" "First," Margaret said, "everyone who hasn't already done it gets a certified copy of their re-recording from the Helena office. I can write you each a letter of instruction so you know exactly what to ask for. Second, anyone who's received a letter from Crow's lawyers keeps a copy and sends a written reply stating that you've reviewed your title chain and found it complete. Third," she paused, "we retain a lawyer." "That costs money," Carl Harmon said. "It does," Margaret agreed. "Less than losing your land." "Who?" Walt asked. "I have a name," Ethan said. "I have a name," Ethan said. Everyone looked at him. Man in Helena named Aldous Frick. He handled a boundary dispute for a rancher near Great Falls 2 years ago against a Crow affiliate company. He won. You've been looking into this, Walt said. Margaret wrote me the name from Helena, Ethan said. Pell at the county office mentioned him. Margaret had suggested it in her note home, which she'd sent back with Garrett Walsh on the return leg of the freight run. She hadn't mentioned it tonight because it was Ethan's to say. She understood whose room this was and who the people in it needed to hear it from. Deacon Pryor said, "I'll put in for a share of the legal fee." Sam Pryor nodded. Agnes Tully said, "Same." One by one, around the room, people said the same or something like it. Not enthusiastically. This was not an enthusiastic crowd. These were people who had learned to be careful about what they committed to, but steadily, with the particular weight of people who had made up their minds. When it was done, Walt looked at Margaret and said, "You did that on purpose." "Did what?" she said. "Let Ethan say the lawyer's name. Made sure it came from him." She held his gaze. "These are his neighbors," she said. "They needed to hear it from someone they trust." "They trust you too," Walt said. "More than you think. Coming in here with those documents." He glanced around the room, then back at her. "You gave people something solid to hold on to. That matters." Clara from her corner looked up from her notebook and watched her father's face. 2 days after the meeting, Crow came back. This time he didn't arrive in the morning. He came at dusk, when the light was going and the temperature had dropped to the point where breath fogged in the air, even inside a heated room if the fire was low. He came alone this time. No lawyers, no wagon, just himself on a dark horse, and he knocked on the door with 2 knocks instead of 3, which was almost polite. Ethan opened the door. Crow stood on the porch and looked at Ethan and didn't say anything for a moment. He looked older than he had the first time, or maybe the light was different. "I heard you had a meeting at Harmon's place," he said. "We did," Ethan said. "That was a mistake." "You can think that," Ethan said. Crow looked past Ethan into the kitchen. Margaret was at the stove. She didn't turn around. Clara was in bed. The lamp was burning low. "I'm going to tell you something," Crow said, "that I don't usually tell people because I usually don't have to." He looked back at Ethan. "I have resources you don't. I have time you don't. I have patience that your neighbors don't. Whatever she found in Helena, whatever legal argument she's built, I have 3 lawyers who can respond to it in territorial court, and territorial court takes 18 months minimum, and most people can't run a cattle operation through 18 months of legal uncertainty without breaking." He kept his voice conversational, almost reasonable. "I'm not threatening you. I'm describing reality." "I appreciate the description," Ethan said. "The offer is still on the table," Crow said. "Same terms." "Same answer," Ethan said. Crow looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked past Ethan at Margaret again, and something shifted in his face. Not anger, not yet, but the beginning of a recalculation. "She's going to cost you," he said quietly. "Get off my porch," Ethan said. Crow stepped back. He adjusted his coat. He was a man who had been told no before and had always eventually converted it to yes, and the feeling of this particular no was new enough that he was still working out what to do with it. He turned and mounted his horse. He rode out without looking back, which Margaret thought was more telling than anything else he'd done. She turned from the stove when the sound of the horse faded. Ethan was still at the door, looking out at the empty yard. "He'll come back," he said. "Yes," she said. "Harder." "Yes." He closed the door. He stood with his hand on the latch for a moment, and Margaret could see the set of his shoulders and the particular tension in them that had been there since the first day she arrived and had slowly, across the weeks, been loosening and had now come back. She set down her spoon. She said, "Ethan." He turned. "We knew he wasn't going to stop," she said. "This was always going to be the part where he decides we mean it." "I know." He came away from the door. He sat down at the table. He looked at his hands. "The lawyer," she said. "Aldous Frick. We should write to him this week." "Already did," Ethan said. "This morning, before you were up." She looked at him. "I woke at 4, he said. "Couldn't sleep. Wrote 3 letters. He looked up. "One to Frick. One to the Territorial Land Office requesting formal review of Crow's competing interest filing. One to the county assessor in Helena asking for confirmation of current water rights registration in the valley." Margaret was quiet. You've been awake since 4 doing legal correspondence, she said. I know how to write a letter, he said, with a slight edge that was not irritation at her but at the situation, at himself for the lost sleep, at all of it. I know you do, she said. He looked at her. The edge went out of his face. I'm not used to this, he said, having someone else in it with me. I know. I keep waiting to feel like I should be handling it alone. You don't have to, she said. That's the part I'm still figuring out, he said honestly. The fire shifted in the grate. The wind moved along the outside wall of the house. Somewhere in the distance, one of the cattle made a sound that carried clean through the cold. Margaret went back to the stove. She finished what she'd been making. She brought 2 bowls to the table and set one in front of Ethan and sat down across from him. And they ate in the quiet that was no longer the empty quiet of the first weeks, but a different kind. The kind that has something in it. The kind that 2 people build between them slowly and without meaning to. The kind that is harder to name than most things and easier to lose than you'd expect. Clara appeared in the hallway in her nightgown. I heard someone on the porch, she said. Crow, Ethan said. He left. Clara looked at the door, then at her father, then at Margaret. Did he try to take the ranch again? He tried to make an argument, Margaret said. Your father closed the door on it. Clara considered this. She came the rest of the way into the kitchen and climbed into her chair and looked at the 2 bowls on the table. Is there more? She asked. There's always more, Margaret said, and got up to get it. Clara watched her go and then looked at her father with the steady, evaluating look that she'd had since the first day. That look that was too old for an 8-year-old and had been too old for as long as Ethan could remember, forged in 2 years of watching her father manage alone and learning to read every room she walked into for signs of what was coming. Papa, she said. What? I think she's going to stay. Ethan looked at his bowl. He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when something was true, and he hadn't decided yet how to be with it. I think so too, he said. Margaret, at the stove, heard them. She kept her back turned and said nothing, because some things were not for her to respond to yet, and she understood that about this family and about this particular moment, which was theirs and not hers to enter. But her hands had gone still on the ladle, and she was smiling. Aldous Frick's reply came on a Wednesday, 9 days after Ethan sent the letter, carried in on the freight wagon by a driver who wasn't Garrett Walsh but knew him, and handed the envelope over with the casual indifference of a man who moved other people's important news for a living, and had stopped thinking about what was inside things. Ethan read it at the kitchen table while Margaret washed the breakfast dishes, and Clara sat across from him pretending to work on her arithmetic, but watching his face over the top of her slate. Frick's letter was 3 pages, written in the dense, careful language of a man who had been practicing territorial law for 20 years and had strong opinions about how to say things precisely. The substance of it, stripped of the legal scaffolding, was this. The competing interest filing by Crow Land Holdings was, in Frick's assessment, built on a procedural foundation that would not survive a formal challenge. The 1882 revision Margaret had identified was exactly the statute he would cite. He had handled 2 previous matters involving Crow affiliates and was familiar with their methods. He was willing to take the case. His fee was stated clearly at the bottom of the 2nd page. Ethan set the letter down. Well, Margaret said, without turning from the sink. He'll take it, Ethan said, and he agrees with you about the 1882 statute. Clara looked up from her slate. So we win? It means we have a real argument, Margaret said, drying her hands. Winning is what happens after the argument. That's less exciting, Clara said. Most of real life is, Margaret said, and Clara made a face that suggested she found this deeply unsatisfying, which was an accurate response. Ethan folded the letter. He held it for a moment before setting it on the table. The fee, he said. I saw it. It's manageable, just. He looked at the window. The sky outside was doing the thing it did in late November. That flat, white-gray that wasn't quite clouds and wasn't quite clear, a sky that seemed to be conserving itself for something. If this runs long, it won't run long, Margaret said. She sat down across from him. Frick says the procedural challenge can be filed in territorial court within 30 days. Once it's filed, Crow's notice of competing interest is suspended pending review. That takes the deadline off the table. Crow knows that too. He'll move before we can file. He'll try. She looked at the letter. Which is why I think we need Frick here. Not in Helena. Here. Ethan looked at her. If Frick rides out and meets with Walt and the other ranchers, reviews their title chains directly, and files a consolidated challenge on behalf of multiple landholders simultaneously, she paused. It changes the scale of the problem for Crow. He's not dealing with one rancher's title dispute anymore. He's dealing with a coordinated challenge from 11 landowners across the valley, backed by documentation and a lawyer who knows his history. Ethan was quiet for a moment. You want to ask Frick to come to Bitter Creek? I think he'd come. His letter suggests he has a personal interest in this beyond the fee. That could be good or bad, Ethan said. It's good if we point it in the right direction, she said. Clara set down her slate. I think you should do it, she said to her father. Both adults looked at her. She shrugged with the particular composure of an 8-year-old who had decided she was a participant in this conversation. You hired a lawyer. Now use the lawyer. That's what lawyers are for. Ethan looked at his daughter for a moment. She's not wrong, Margaret said. She's 8, Ethan said. She's also not wrong, Margaret said. Frick arrived on a Friday, 12 days later, on the same freight route as Margaret had taken, Garrett Walsh's wagon, which was becoming something of an unofficial transport for the people involved in saving the Caldwell Ranch. He was a lean, dry-humored man in his late 40s with a permanent squint from reading small print in bad light, and the kind of handshake that told you immediately he was not a man who wasted effort on impression management. He sat at the Caldwell kitchen table for 3 hours on Friday evening, going through every document Margaret had assembled. The deed, the re-recording, Crow's competing interest filing, the letters sent to Walt and Bud and Pete, the preliminary agreement Agnes had nearly signed. He read without commenting. When he finished, he asked 3 questions. The exact date Crow's representatives had first contacted Ethan, the date of Margaret's visit to the Helena County office, and the name of the clerk who had confirmed the re-recording's presence. Pell, Margaret said. Howard Pell. Frick wrote the name down. I know Pell, he said. He's a careful man. He won't testify voluntarily, but if subpoenaed, he'll tell exactly what he observed. He set his pen down. The picture here is clear. The competing interest filing was made with knowledge of the contrary evidence. That moves this from aggressive land acquisition into territory that is, at minimum, actionable misrepresentation. At maximum, it's fraud on the territorial court. Ethan said, Can you prove that? Proving intent is always the difficulty, Frick said, but I don't need to prove it to defeat the claim. I need to prove the claim is without foundation, which is considerably easier. He looked at the documents. What I'd like to do, with your permission, is spend tomorrow visiting the other affected ranchers, see their documents, establish the pattern in writing. He looked up. 11 ranchers filing a coordinated challenge is a different animal than 1. Crow's lawyers know how to manage 1. 11 requires a different kind of resource, and it draws territorial attention that he would prefer to avoid. Territorial attention meaning? Ethan asked. The land office in Helena has been watching Crow's acquisition activity for 2 years, Frick said quietly. They haven't had sufficient grounds to formally review his methods. A coordinated challenge from 11 ranchers, backed by documentation showing a pattern of filings made on false premises, gives them those grounds. Margaret felt something sharpen in her attention. You've been in contact with the land office. Frick looked at her steadily. I have former colleagues there. You came here already expecting this, she said. Not accusatory, just noting it. I came here hoping for it, he said. Your letter described a situation I've seen the edges of twice before and never had the documentation to address properly. He looked at Ethan. Your wife, Margaret, went to Helena and found the right piece and knew what it meant. That's not nothing. Most people find the piece and don't know what to do with it. She's not, Ethan started and then stopped. A brief silence. She's not my wife, he said. Not yet. Margaret looked at the table. She was not a woman who blushed easily, but something warm moved through her that she chose not to examine in the middle of a legal strategy meeting. Frick looked between them with the practiced neutrality of a man who had sat in rooms with complicated personal situations for 20 years and had learned that acknowledging them directly never helped anything. Right, he said. Either way, the documentation is excellent. I'd like to begin with the Harmon place in the morning. Saturday at Walt Harmon's was a different kind of meeting than the first one. This time, it was Frick who stood at the front of the room and spoke, and the room listened with a different quality of attention. The attention you gave to a man who carried institutional weight, whose words had legal consequence, who was not rallying them but assessing them, and whose assessment would determine what happened next. Frick reviewed each rancher's documents in turn, making notes, asking precise questions. He found two situations he hadn't expected. Roy Birch had a genuine irregularity in his 1876 title transfer, not manufactured by Crow, just a clerical error from the original filing that had never been corrected. And Deacon Pryor's water rights documentation had a gap that was different in character from the others, stemming from a change in territorial water law in 1881 that had required re-registration and which Deacon had not completed. These were real problems, not Crow's manufactured ones, but actual vulnerabilities. Frick told them both directly, without softening it, and the room watched both men absorb the information. Roy Birch went pale. Deacon Pryor's expression did something complicated and then went flat. "These are correctable," Frick said. "Neither constitutes a fundamental defect, but they need to be addressed before we file the consolidated challenge, because Crow's lawyers will find them and use them to complicate the proceeding if we leave them exposed." "How long to correct them?" Roy asked. Roy's situation, 2 to 3 weeks with the right filing. Deacon's water registration, possibly 6 weeks given the current land office backlog. Frick paused. "Which means we have a timing problem." The room shifted. Margaret had been sitting near the back, next to Clara, who had come again and was again nominally drawing but was clearly listening. Margaret did the math in her head. Crow's original deadline had been 32 days from his first visit. That was now 12 days away. If the consolidated challenge couldn't be filed until Deacon's water situation was resolved, they would be past the deadline before they could move. She looked at Ethan. He was looking at her. He'd reached the same place. Frick said, "The option is to file the challenge for the 9 ranchers with clean title now and address Birch and Pryor separately. That still changes Crow's calculus significantly. 9 is still 9. "Crow will pick at the 2 who aren't in," Walt said. "Possibly," Frick agreed. "But with the main filing in place, he's exposed. Going after individual weak links while a coordinated territorial challenge is active draws exactly the kind of attention he doesn't want." Agnes Tully said, "What about my preliminary agreement?" "Already addressed," Frick said. "I've drafted a notice of rescission under the terms of the preliminary agreement itself. You haven't signed the final contract. The preliminary is voidable. We send the notice this week." Agnes looked at the table. She looked at her son, Thomas. "All right," she said. The meeting ran 2 more hours. By the end of it, 9 ranchers had signed authorizations for Frick to file on their behalf. Roy Birch signed with the understanding that his irregular title transfer would be corrected concurrently. Deacon Pryor, after a long silence, said he wanted to think overnight, and everyone in the room accepted that because Deacon was not a man you pushed, and the situation with his water rights was genuinely more complicated than the others. When it was over and people were putting on coats and moving toward the door, Walt Harmon came and stood next to Margaret near the sideboard where the documents were stacked. He didn't say anything for a moment. He picked up the certified copy of the Caldwell re-recording and looked at it and set it back down. "You know what's going to happen when we file," he said. "Crow retaliates," she said. "Crow retaliates," Walt confirmed. "He's not going to go quietly into a territorial review. He'll hit what he can hit before the filing ties his hands." "I know." "Your place is the most exposed," he said. "It's the one he wants most, the water there." "I know," she said again. Walt looked at her. He had the expression of a man saying something he thought needed to be said, even though he'd rather not say it. "You came here 6 weeks ago with a carpet bag and no ranch experience," he said. "And now you're standing in the middle of the biggest land dispute this valley's had in 15 years. "Yes," she said. "How are you not more scared?" She was quiet for a moment. "I am scared," she said. "I just don't think being scared is relevant to what needs doing." Walt looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something she hadn't seen him do before. He put out his hand. She shook it. "Welcome to the valley," Walt said. Like he meant it. Like it was the first time he'd said it and intended it. They filed on Wednesday. Frick rode to Helena with the consolidated challenge signed by 9 ranchers, the documentation Margaret had assembled, and a cover letter to the Territorial Land Office that outlined the pattern of filings Crow's lawyers had made across the valley, and formally requested a review of Crow Land Holdings' acquisition practices. The filing suspension kicked in automatically under territorial procedure. Crow's competing interest notice against the Caldwell property was suspended pending judicial review. The deadline he'd set, which was now 4 days away, was legally moot. Margaret learned this from Frick's telegram, which arrived Thursday morning. She was in the barn when Ethan brought it out. She was helping move hay to the upper storage because one of the ranch hands, a teenager named Miles who came 3 days a week, had strained his back and they were short on help. She had hay in her hair and a smear of something on her coat sleeve that she preferred not to identify. Ethan stood in the barn doorway and read the telegram aloud. She stood there with the pitchfork in her hand and listened. When he finished, she set the pitchfork against the wall. She sat down on a hay bale. She put her face in her hands for a moment, not crying, just taking the space to absorb it, to feel the release of something she'd been carrying since that first afternoon when Crow walked into this kitchen uninvited and sat in Ethan's chair like he already owned it. When she looked up, Ethan was sitting on the hay bale across from her. 4 weeks ago, you were on a train from Pennsylvania, he said. I know, she said. Her voice was steady. Almost. You've been here 7 weeks total. I know how long I've been here, she said, same as she'd said it the first time, but differently. Not defensively, just as a fact between them. 7 weeks, he said again, quietly, like he was still getting used to the math of it. She looked at him. He looked back at her. The barn was warm from the animals and the hay, and the smell of it was layered and particular, and outside the light was the thin winter light that made everything look like a photograph of itself. Ethan, she said. Yeah. The filing suspension is not the end of this. I know. Crow still has lawyers and resources and… Margaret, he said. She stopped. I know, he said. I'm not celebrating it as the end. I'm noting that it happened. He paused. That you made it happen. She said nothing. I want to say something, he said, and I need you to let me say it without interrupting it with practical information. I'll try, she said. He looked at his hands. He had the expression of a man who was working through something he'd been working through for a while and had finally arrived at the place where it needed to come out. When you told me on the wagon, the first day, that the agency had made a mistake, that you weren't who I'd asked for, he stopped. My first thought was that I'd been cheated, that I'd sent for someone who could do a specific thing and they'd sent me someone who couldn't. That was a reasonable thought, she said. Let me finish. She was quiet. My second thought, he said, was that Clara looked at you and said you were the one, and Clara has been right about more things than I have since her mother died, and I didn't know what to do with that. He paused. And my third thought, which took about 3 weeks longer to arrive, was that the person I asked the agency for would have helped me manage what I had, and the person they sent helped me understand what I was losing without knowing it. Margaret was very still. I'm not good at this, he said. Saying things. Rebecca used to say I communicated primarily through tasks, which was probably accurate. Primarily through tasks seems like a valid form of communication, Margaret said. It has limits, he said. Yes, she said. He looked up at her. I don't want you here because I need help running the ranch, he said. I want you here because I've been in that kitchen with you for 7 weeks and I can't… He stopped. I can't imagine it without you in it anymore. That happened fast, and I don't entirely know what to do with it. The wind moved against the barn wall. One of the horses shifted in its stall. Ethan, she said softly. Yeah. I came here because I'd lost my job, and the man I thought I'd marry chose someone else, and my room in Harrisburg was very small, and I read an advertisement and answered it on a practical basis. She paused. I want you to know that. I didn't arrive here with any romantic intention. I arrived here trying to make something work. I know that, he said. What I didn't expect, she said, was that making something work would feel like… She searched for the word and found it wasn't the right kind of problem for someone who used words as tools. Like this, she said, like whatever this is. Yeah, he said, like that. They sat in the barn on opposite hay bales in the thin winter light, and neither of them said anything for a while, which was its own kind of conversation. The kind that Ethan had always been better at than the verbal version, and which Margaret was learning to read. I should get back to the hay, she said finally. Probably. he said. Neither of them moved for another moment. Then Margaret stood up and picked up the pitchfork, and Ethan stood up and walked over and took it from her. "I'll finish the hay," he said. "Go get warm." She looked at him. "I'm not cold." "You've got hay in your hair," he said. "I know." "Go get warm anyway." She looked at him for one more moment. Then she went, and she was almost to the barn door when he said, "Margaret." She turned. "Stay," he said. Just that. The word simple and direct, the way frontier men said important things when they'd finally decided to say them. She held his gaze across the barn. "I planned to," she said. What happened next happened fast, the way trouble always does when it's been patient long enough. Crow's response to the filing came not through lawyers but through action, which was what Walt Harmon had predicted and what Margaret had prepared for in the abstract without being fully prepared for in the specific. It started with the eastern fence line. Miles came in on Monday morning white-faced and talking fast, which was not Miles's usual mode. He was a slow-talking, methodical boy who took his time about everything. And the speed of him was alarming before the content was. The eastern fence was down, not broken down, taken down. 3 sections, pulled from the posts cleanly, the wire rolled and removed, not just damaged. The cattle in the upper pasture had drifted through the gap overnight into the creek bottomland, which was currently unfenced on the Crow side, and where 4 of them had gotten into boggy ground near the creek bank. Ethan was out the door before Miles finished his second sentence. Margaret stood in the kitchen for about 30 seconds. Then she went to the window and looked at the eastern tree line and looked at the sky, which was flat gray and promising snow by afternoon. She went to the barn. She saddled the gray mare, which she could do competently now, the 7 weeks having covered a great deal of practical ground, and rode out to the eastern pasture. The fence was exactly as Miles had described, methodical, deliberate. Not a section that had given way under weather or animal pressure. The posts were intact. The wire was gone. Ethan was already in the boggy ground near the creek bank, knee-deep in cold muck, working to get the first of the stuck cattle onto solid footing. Miles was behind him. The temperature was in the low 20s and the wind off the creek had teeth. She didn't ask if he needed help. She dismounted, tied the mare to a post, and went into the mud. They got all 4 cattle out over the course of an hour and a half. Margaret was cold to the bone by the end of it, her boots soaked through and her hands barely working. She didn't say anything about any of that because Ethan looked worse and Miles looked terrified in the way young people look when they're afraid they've done something wrong even when they haven't. "You didn't break the fence," she told Miles, when they were walking the cattle back up toward the holding pen. "This wasn't weather." "I know," Miles said. "Then stop looking like you're responsible for it." Miles nodded. He was 16 and had the grateful, slightly stricken expression of a boy who needed to hear that more than he would ever admit. Ethan, to Margaret's left, said nothing. He was doing the internal processing thing, working through it in silence, which she now recognized and knew to leave room for. He said it finally when they were closing the pen gate. He moved fast. "Faster than I expected," she said honestly. "He's telling us the filing made him angry." "Yes, or he's trying to give himself a factual argument that our land management is inadequate, that we can't control our own cattle, that our fences are failing, that the operation isn't viable." She wiped her hands on her coat. "Either way, we document it." Document a broken fence? Document a systematically removed fence, with dates and the condition of the posts and the fact that the wire was taken rather than broken. She looked at him. "If this goes to territorial review, we want a record of everything that happens from here forward." Ethan looked at the empty post holes where the wire had been pulled. He looked at the creek. He looked at the gray sky coming down. "He's going to keep doing this," he said. "Until it costs him more than it costs us," Margaret said, "which is why we need to make sure that every single thing he does is on paper." The next 11 days were the hardest stretch since Margaret had arrived. The fence on the eastern line was repaired on Tuesday, with Walt Harmon's son Carl coming over to help. Because the job was too large for 2 people in the available time, and Carl arrived at 7 in the morning without being asked, which was the Valley's version of a declaration of solidarity. On Thursday, someone cut the water line from the creek pump to the south trough. Not sabotaged dramatically, just a clean cut in the pipe, the kind a man makes with a good knife. and the cattle on the south end went without water for 4 hours before Miles found it on his morning check. Margaret documented it. Measurements, location, the clean edge of the cut, the time it was discovered, and the estimated time since it had been made based on how dry the trough was. On Saturday, 2 of Crow's men rode along the boundary road at midday, slowly, not on Caldwell land, but right along its edge, doing nothing except being visible and taking their time about it. Ethan watched them from the barn door. "Don't go out there," Margaret said from behind him. "I wasn't going to," he said. "You looked like you were going to." He turned away from the door. "I know what he's doing," he said, with the controlled irritation of a man who understood exactly the game being played and found the understanding almost worse than not knowing. "He wants a confrontation," she said. "Something physical, something he can use. A story about an unstable rancher and a mail-order bride who've turned the valley against its most substantial landowner." "I know." "So we don't give him the story," she said. Ethan looked at her. "I've been managing my temper around Silas Crow for 3 years," he said. "I know how to not give him a story." "I know you do," she said. "I'm saying it for me as much as for you." He looked at her more carefully. "You're angry," he said, with slight surprise, not because he thought her incapable of it, but because she'd been so steady through all of it. "I'm furious," she said quietly. "You walked into this house and sat in your chair and drank your coffee and looked at your tin box on the shelf, and I stood there and was hospitable because that's what you do. And the whole time he was planning to take Clara's inheritance." She paused. "Yes, I'm angry." "Good," Ethan said with a conviction that surprised her. She looked at him. "Means you care what happens here," he said. "Means you're not—" He stopped. "Not what?" "Waiting to see if it's worth staying," he said. "That's what I was going to say." She held his gaze. "I told you in the barn," she said. "I plan to stay." "I know. I'm still getting used to believing it." Outside, the sound of Crow's men on the road had faded. The wind had come up from the north, which meant the temperature was going to drop another 5 degrees by nightfall. Inside the barn, it was warm and smelled of hay and horses and the particular quiet of a place where work had happened and would happen again. Margaret turned toward the house. She'd taken 4 steps when Ethan said, "The filing review notice came this morning." She turned back. "Frick sent it ahead of the formal letter," he said. "The Territorial Land Office has opened a formal review of Crow Land Holdings acquisition practices, valley-wide." He paused. "It means everything he does now is being watched by people who have authority to do something about it." She absorbed this. "When did you find out?" she said. "This morning, before the fence check." "And you waited until now to tell me?" "I needed to think about it," he said. He looked at his hands, then at her. "Because it means we're past the worst of it. It means the thing you started. The trip to Helena, the documents, the meeting at Walt's. It worked. All of it." He paused. "And I didn't know how to say that in a way that was enough." Margaret stood in the barn doorway in her wet boots with hay in her hair and mud on her coat, and looked at a man who had been carrying this land and this grief and this daughter alone for 3 years, who communicated primarily through tasks, who was standing in front of her trying to find words because he decided that this particular thing was too important to express through action alone. "It's enough," she said quietly. He nodded once. She went to the house. She got warm. She stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the eastern fence line, repaired and solid, and at the pasture beyond it, and at the creek in the distance that ran along the boundary of the land that was Clara's and Ethan's, and that was going to stay that way. Clara came in from her room where she'd been doing lessons and stood next to Margaret at the window. "What are you looking at?" Clara asked. "The fence," Margaret said. Clara looked at it. "It's fixed." "It is." "Carl helped." "He did." Clara was quiet for a moment, then, "Are we going to be okay?" Margaret put her hand on Clara's shoulder, and Clara, who had not yet fully decided how she felt about being touched by someone who was not her father, stayed very still for a moment and then leaned the smallest amount against Margaret's arm. "We're going to be okay," Margaret said. She meant it, which was the only kind of promise worth making. The formal notice from the Territorial Land Office arrived on a Tuesday in the first week of December, delivered not by the freight wagon, but by a territorial marshal's courier. A young man on a black horse who handed the envelope to Ethan at the door with the brisk efficiency of someone who had 6 more stops to make before nightfall. Ethan brought it inside. He set it on the kitchen table. He looked at it for a moment before opening it, the way a man looks at something he has been working toward for long enough that the arrival of it feels slightly unreal. Margaret was at the stove. Clara was at the table with her reading primer. Both of them watched him. He opened it and read it standing up. The notice was 4 pages. The Territorial Land Office, following its formal review, had determined that the competing interest filing by Crow Land Holdings against the Caldwell property was procedurally defective under the 1882 Territorial Statute revision and factually unsupported given the extant re-recording on file since October 1879. The filing was formally withdrawn from the territorial record. The Caldwell land claim was confirmed as uncontested. Additionally, and this was the part that Ethan read twice before looking up, the review had identified a pattern of similar filings across Jefferson County that warranted further investigation by the Territorial Attorney General's office, and Crow Land Holdings had been formally notified of that inquiry. Ethan set the document down on the table. Clara looked at his face. "Papa." "We're all right," he said. His voice came out slightly different than he intended. Not broken, just carrying more weight than a 3-word sentence usually carried. Clara picked up the document. She was 8 and could read well when she wanted to, and she read the first page slowly and then looked at Margaret. "It says the claim is gone," she said. "It does," Margaret said. "So Crow can't take the land." "Not through that filing, no." Clara set the document down carefully. She looked at it for a moment. Then she did something neither of them expected. She put her head down on her folded arms on the table and cried. Not dramatically. Just quietly, with the particular release of a child who has been holding something very tightly for a long time and has finally been told she can put it down. Her shoulders shook twice, and then she breathed out and was still. Ethan moved to her and put his hand on her back. He didn't say anything. He just kept his hand there. Margaret turned back to the stove because they needed a moment that was theirs, and because her own throat had done something she needed a minute to manage. The valley did not celebrate in any dramatic fashion because that was not how this valley operated. What happened instead was a series of small, specific acknowledgments from people who expressed things through action rather than declaration. Walt Harmon sent over 2 cords of split firewood without a note, which Ethan said was the equivalent of a speech from Walt. June Sears brought a venison pie to the door on Thursday, came in, sat down, had coffee, and said to Margaret, "I told Bud back in October that you were going to be trouble for Crow. He didn't believe me." She took a long sip of coffee. "I told him I was right." "How'd he take that?" Margaret asked. "Same way he always takes it," June said cheerfully. "Badly, then eventually." Agnes Tully came on Saturday with Thomas, who was carrying a small crate of dried goods that he set on the kitchen counter without being asked, and then stood near the door with the particular self-consciousness of a teenager in a room where adults were talking. Agnes sat down and said directly and without preamble, "I want you to know I understand what would have happened if you hadn't found that preliminary agreement clause." She paused. "The creek. My creek runs to the Sears property. If I'd signed, every rancher downstream would have been paying Crow for water inside 5 years." "You would have found it," Margaret said. "I would have found it after I'd signed the final contract," Agnes said. "That's not the same thing." Margaret didn't argue with that because it was true. Deacon Pryor came on Sunday. He'd completed his water rights re-registration, which Frick had helped him file, and he stood on the porch in his coat and hat and said to Ethan, "I was the holdout. At the meeting, I almost didn't sign." "I know," Ethan said. "If I hadn't—" "But you did," Ethan said. Deacon nodded slowly. He looked at Ethan and then passed him into the kitchen where Margaret was visible at the table with Clara and their reading lesson. He looked back at Ethan. "You landed better than you knew," he said, and left. Ethan stood on the porch for a moment after Deacon's wagon pulled out of the yard. The air was sharp and dry, the kind of December cold that was honest about itself. And the sky was the deep blue of a clear-weather winter afternoon, the mountains to the north hard-edged and white. He came back inside. "What did Deacon say?" Margaret asked, without looking up from the primer. "That I landed better than I knew." Margaret looked up. Ethan looked back at her. Clara, between them, turned a page. Crow's response to the territorial inquiry came in the form of silence, which was in some ways louder than anything else he could have done. He did not come to the Caldwell Ranch again. His men did not ride the boundary road. The letters to Valley ranchers stopped. His lawyers filed a formal response to the territorial attorney general that was, according to Frick's letter in mid-December, defensive in tone and notably shorter than the situation would have suggested if Crow had believed he had strong ground to stand on. Frick's assessment was careful. The attorney general's inquiry would take time, possibly the better part of a year, and its outcome was not certain. Crow was not a man who disappeared. He had resources, and he had patience, and he would be watching for an opening for a long time to come. But the immediate threat was gone. The land was secure. The coordinated challenge had worked. Margaret read Frick's letter twice, and then set it in the tin box alongside the deed and the re-recording, because it was part of the record of what had happened, and the record needed to be complete. She sat at the kitchen table alone with the tin box open in front of her, and thought about what Frick had written. That Crow would be watching, that the situation required continued vigilance, that the Valley ranchers should maintain their coordination and keep their documentation current. All of that was true. All of it required continued attention and work, and the kind of sustained effort that didn't look like victory from the outside because it was really just more of the same difficult, ongoing management that frontier life required every day. And sitting there, alone in the kitchen in the December light, Margaret allowed herself to feel the full weight of the past 9 weeks. From the train platform to the wagon ride to the first hard days of learning the stove and the pump and the cattle rotations, to Helena and Howard Pell and the thin moment of relief. When Pell said it's there, and she had stood at his counter and kept her face still until she was outside, and she put her face in her hands the way she had in the barn when the suspension notice came, and this time she let herself sit with it for a full minute before she picked her head up. The kitchen was warm. It smelled of coffee and wood smoke and the dried herbs she'd hung near the window, because Hattie Drummond had told her they'd keep the air from going stale in winter. The floorboards near the fireplace still had the scuff marks from Crow's boots the morning he'd walked in, unasked, and sat in Ethan's chair. She looked at those marks. Then she got up, got a brush from the cabinet, and scrubbed them until they were gone. The conversation she'd been expecting from Ethan came on a Wednesday evening when Clara was asleep and the wind was moving around the house in a way that made the inside feel like a separate world from everything outside it. He came in from checking the livestock, took off his coat and boots, poured coffee, and sat down at the table. He looked at his coffee. He looked at the window. He looked at Margaret, who was mending a tear in Clara's winter coat that had been waiting for a week. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right," she said. "And I want you to answer it honestly, even if the honest answer is not what I want to hear." She set down the coat. "Go ahead." He looked at his hands around the cup. "When the agency made the mistake, when they sent you instead of whoever they meant to send, you knew on the wagon, that first day. You told me." "Yes." "And you could have gone back." He looked at her. "I was in no position to make you stay. The situation wasn't what you'd agreed to. The work was harder than anything you'd done. I was—" He paused. "I was not easy to be around." "You were grieving," she said. "That's different from difficult." "I was both," he said, with the self-awareness of a man who had been doing some accounting. "The point is, you could have gone back to Pennsylvania and had a legitimate reason." "I could have," she said. "Why didn't you?" She was quiet for a moment, not because she didn't know the answer, but because the answer had several layers, and she was deciding how many of them to say. "The first week," she said, "I stayed because I'd made a commitment, and I don't abandon things because they're harder than I expected." That was stubbornness more than anything. "And after the first week?" "After the first week, Clara put her hand in mine at the dry goods store while Hattie Drummond was looking at me like I'd probably be dead by February." She paused. "And I understood that leaving would mean something to her that I wasn't willing for it to mean." "And after that?" She looked at him. "You know what happened after that." "I want you to say it." She held his gaze. "After that, I stopped thinking about Pennsylvania," she said. "I started thinking about the eastern fence and the hay yield and the water line and what Crow was going to do next. I started thinking in terms of us and ours before I'd noticed I was doing it." She paused. "This place got into me fast. I don't fully understand it. I just know it happened." Ethan was quiet for a moment. The fire shifted. The wind moved along the north wall. "I need to ask you something formal," he said, "and I'm going to do it badly because I've been thinking about how to do it for 3 weeks, and I still don't have the right words." Margaret looked at him. "I have a ranch that's secure now, but still has hard years ahead of it," he said. "I have a daughter who needs more than I can give her alone. I have a grief that's mostly handled but not entirely, and some days it surfaces and I'm not good company on those days." He paused. "And I have, whatever this is, what's been building in this kitchen for 9 weeks." He looked at her directly. "I'm asking you to stay, formally, permanently, as my wife, if that's something you're willing to consider." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. "You already asked me to stay," she said. "In the barn." "That was informal," he said. "You said one word." "I'm aware. I'm trying to do better this time." She looked at the table. She looked at the tin box on the shelf. Deed, re-recording, Frick's letter, all of it nested together. The paper record of something that had been saved. She looked at Clara's coat with the mend half finished on the table between them. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah." "I scrubbed Crow's boot marks off your floor this afternoon," she said. He looked at her. "I noticed." "That's not an answer to your question," she said. "I know that. I'm just—" She stopped. "I'm trying to tell you something about how I think of this place. That I look at it, and I see what needs doing, and I want to do it. Not because I have to, because I want to." She met his eyes. "That's probably not the answer you were looking for either." "It's actually exactly the answer I was looking for," he said. She let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes. I told you in the barn that I planned to stay." "You did," he said. "I meant it then." "I know," he said. "I wanted to ask properly." "It was proper enough," she said. He looked at her with the expression that had been building across 9 weeks, the one she'd watched move from wariness to assessment to reluctant respect to something warmer and more specific that she now recognized as the face of a man who had decided, after a long time of not deciding anything about his own life, to decide something. He reached across the table. He put his hand over hers. She turned her hand over and held his. They sat like that for a while, in the kitchen that was warm and smelled of wood smoke, in the house that had been cold and silent and was neither of those things anymore. Clara found out the next morning, not because either of them told her in any formal way. It was simply that she came downstairs before full light, as she sometimes did, and found Margaret already at the stove and her father already at the table with his coffee, and something in the quality of the room was different. Children are the most sensitive instruments in any household. They feel the change in atmospheric pressure before anyone names it. Clara stood in the kitchen doorway in her nightgown and looked at both of them. "Something happened," she said. "I asked Margaret to stay permanently," Ethan said. "She said yes." Clara looked at Margaret. "As our family?" "As your family," Margaret said. Clara considered this. She had the serious, careful face she wore when she was processing something important, and Margaret had learned not to try to fill the silence when Clara wore that face. She needed to come to things in her own time. "I knew she was going to stay," Clara said finally to her father. "I know," Ethan said. "I told you." "You did." "You didn't believe me." "I believed you a little bit," he said. "I got there eventually." Clara looked at Margaret one more time. Something in the child's face shifted, something private and complicated and young. The expression of a girl who had been without a mother for 2 years and had learned, the hard way, that wanting something didn't mean you'd get it, and was now standing in the presence of the thing she'd wanted, and was working out how to hold it without holding it too tightly. She crossed the kitchen and put her arms around Margaret's waist. It lasted about 4 seconds. Then she let go, stepped back, sat down at the table, and picked up her primer. "Are we having biscuits?" she asked. "We're having biscuits," Margaret said. The wedding was in February, at the Harmon place, because Walt's kitchen was the largest in the valley, and Hattie Drummond insisted on doing it properly if it was going to be done at all, which meant food and people and something that looked like a real occasion rather than 2 people signing a paper in a county office. It was not a large event. It was not a smooth one. Hattie's venison pie came out of the oven 40 minutes late because the Harmon stove ran hotter than Hattie's and she hadn't adjusted for it, which she took personally. Bud Sears gave a toast that started well and then got long and was quietly ended by June putting her hand on his arm. Agnes Tully cried, which surprised everyone, including Agnes. Deacon Pryor brought his fiddle, which no one had asked him to do and which turned out to be the best part of the evening. Clara wore a blue dress that Margaret had made from fabric purchased in town, and she stood through the ceremony with the contained dignity of a child who has decided that this is an important occasion and is behaving accordingly, and she held Margaret's hand during the part where the justice of the peace said things about commitment and permanence, and Margaret held it back. Ethan got the words right when it was his turn to say them. He'd practiced, she could tell, because he said them without stumbling and without looking at the floor, which was not his natural mode, and she loved him for the effort of it. She got her own words right. She'd written them in her notebook 2 nights before, alone at the kitchen table after Ethan was asleep, the way she'd always prepared for things that mattered. Not because she didn't know what she felt, but because the feeling was large enough that she wanted to be sure of the words before they were in the air and couldn't be taken back. After, when the food was mostly eaten and Deacon was playing something slow and the room had relaxed into the particular warmth of people who have shared something, Walt Harmon came and stood next to Margaret near the wall. He had his coffee cup. She had hers. They stood and looked at the room together. 9 weeks, Walt said. 12 now, she said. From the train platform, he said, to this. Yes. He shook his head slowly, not in disbelief. In the particular acknowledgement of a man who has lived long enough to know that some things don't follow any predictable logic, and that trying to explain them after the fact is a waste of energy better spent on accepting them. You know what I think about when I think about what you did? He said. Tell me, she said. I think about Ed Pritchard, he said. Sold 3 years ago. His cattle, his family, his land, gone. And I think about John Merkel before him, and now I think about what would have happened to Agnes's Creek. He paused. The thing you found in Helena, that re-recording, it wasn't just Ethan's land you saved. You understand that. I understand it, she said. Does it feel like enough? Given what it cost you? She looked at the room, at Ethan talking with Carl Harmon near the door, at Clara sitting on the floor with Thomas Tully looking at something in a book, at June Sears laughing at something Bud had said, at Deacon's hands moving on the fiddle strings, at the particular improbable life that had assembled itself around a clerical error and a wagon ride, and a woman who had answered an advertisement on a practical basis. It feels like exactly enough, she said. More than enough. Walt nodded. He drank his coffee. After a moment he said, You know he sent for someone who knew ranch work. I know. He got someone who knew everything else, Walt said. He looked at her sideways. That worked out. She smiled. A real one, the kind that arrived without management. It did, she said. There are things you can plan for in life and things you cannot. Margaret Ellis had planned, in Pennsylvania, for a sensible future, steady work, modest comfort, reasonable companionship, the kind of life that looked right from the outside, even if it was quietly insufficient from the inside. She had been sensible about all of it. She had been patient and prepared and realistic, and none of it had worked. And then a clerical error had put her on a train to a place she'd never been to meet a man who needed someone she wasn't. That is the part that no one talks about when they talk about resilience or courage or second chances. The part where the plan fails not because you did anything wrong, but simply because life is not organized around what people deserve or have prepared for. It fails, and then you are standing on a platform in Montana in a coat that isn't warm enough for the wind. And a man with grief in his eyes and a child at home is looking at you and recalibrating every expectation he had, and you are doing the same, and neither of you has any idea what comes next. What comes next, it turns out, is built moment by moment out of the materials available. A record book read by lamplight, a trip to Helena in a freight wagon, 3 documents spread on a kitchen table, a meeting in a neighbor's house, a fence repaired in frozen mud. It is built out of the willingness to show up for the thing in front of you, even when you are cold and tired and uncertain whether any of it is working. Margaret Caldwell. It took her 3 weeks to stop correcting herself when she said it, understood by spring that belonging was not something you were given. It was not assigned by geography or blood or legal document. It was something you built incrementally, through the accumulation of small choices made when no one was watching. The choice to stay when staying was hard, to ask the question when asking was uncomfortable, to stand in someone's kitchen and show them the evidence that could save them, even when they looked at you and hadn't yet decided if you were worth listening to. She had come to Montana as the wrong person sent to the wrong place by a filing error in an agency office. She had stayed because of what she found there, not the land, not even the man, but the accumulation of small necessary things that added up, without her noticing exactly when, to a life. In March, when the snow was pulling back from the south-facing slopes and the cattle were moving into the lower pasture with the particular purpose of animals who have survived a winter and know what that means, Clara came to find Margaret in the garden plot that Margaret had expanded that week, turning the soil for the early planting. Clara stood at the edge of the plot in her boots and her coat, holding a piece of paper. "What's that?" Margaret asked. "A letter," Clara said. "From the agency." Margaret straightened. She looked at the paper. Clara held it out. "It's for Papa, but he said I could give it to you." She took it. It was a brief letter from the placement agency, formal and slightly apologetic, noting that they had discovered a filing error from the previous October and that the placement of Miss Margaret Ellis with the Caldwell Ranch had been made in error. The intended placement had been a Mrs. Martha Elliston of Kansas, and asking whether a corrective resolution was required. Margaret read it twice. She thought about Martha Elliston of Kansas, who presumably had ended up somewhere she hadn't planned, through the same error, wondering about the Montana ranch she'd been supposed to go to. She made a note in her mind to mention to Ethan that they should perhaps write to the agency about Martha, that Martha's situation should be sorted out, if it hadn't been. She folded the letter. Clara was watching her. "What does it say?" "It says the agency knows they made a mistake," Margaret said. "Are they sorry?" "They say so." Clara looked at the garden plot, at the turned soil, at the seed packets stacked at the end of the row. She looked at the house behind her and the barn beyond it, and the mountains at the edge of everything, white, still at the tops but losing ground daily. "It wasn't a mistake," Clara said, with the finality of an 8-year-old who has considered the matter and arrived at her verdict. Margaret looked at her daughter. She had been thinking of her that way for 2 months now, cautiously at first, and then less cautiously, because Clara had been making it easy, and Margaret suspected Clara knew she was making it easy and was doing it on purpose, which was a level of emotional intelligence that continued to astonish her. "No," Margaret said, "it wasn't." She put the letter in her coat pocket. She picked up her trowel. She went back to turning the soil, which needed doing, the way everything on this land needed doing. Not perfectly, not smoothly, but steadily and with the full presence of someone who was exactly where she intended to be. Clara sat down at the edge of the garden plot and watched, and after a while she picked up a spare trowel and started helping, the way she helped with most things now. Not because she was asked, but because it was hers too, this land, this garden, this life. And she had decided, in the straightforward way of children who know what they want and claim it without apology, to treat it accordingly. The mountains held the light of the late afternoon. The cattle moved in the lower pasture. Somewhere across the property line, the creek ran where it had always run, through land that was still theirs, through a valley that had held together when someone tried to pull it apart. Margaret Caldwell turned the soil and planted seeds in the ground and did not think about Pennsylvania.